Ammon Hillman is very popular for his talks about drugs and pharmacon, which is really just drugs in the ancient world. But his talk about cults and medicine and all these other wild stuff about Jesus in a park with a kid. But what he doesn't really do is ever really give lectures on actual history. So anything he says that is historical, the next sentence is going to be something made up by him. And it's difficult to see. So what happens is that people will be very big fans with him. They will realize that he's not really talking about anything in reality, and then he will, lose those fans, and probably end up coming to my stream to talk about why they don't like him more or whatever. But these people don't really ever get an opportunity to actually understand what's actually happening in history. What is the fake and what is the real? And for that reason, we're gonna listen to a lecture by an actual scholar, Vivian Nutton, who is one of the top tier scholars on the drugs in antiquity, on medicine and Galen. And we're gonna have to watch this because it's really, really interesting. What did Galen actually say? What did he actually believe? Who was he as a person? And not only that, Vivian Nutton, he's really interesting because Vivian Nutton, he actually did a paper with John Scarborough. John Scarborough, the one who supervised Ammon's dissertation. So we're getting some interesting connections here. But anyways, Vivian Nutton, he's a top tier guy. But let's get into it here. Let's actually watch. Oh, that's just a black screen. Let's actually watch him and see what he has to say.
I made the point that, unlike many other disciplines, classic students dealt with a group of finite texts, finite material, apart from discoveries on papyrus. We knew all that we had to know. Now, my supervisor commented in the margin that this was not true of medicine and science. And my future biographer might well conclude that this little comment set me on a lifetime's adventure looking for texts in ancient medicine and science, not least because the author of that squiggle in the margin was Sir Geoffrey Lloyd, who is today the greatest world expert on ancient science. Alas for the biographer, I completely forgot about that note made by my supervisor, and I'm quite prepared to say other undergraduates would have done the same. And it was 20 years later, when I was clearing out some old papers, that I discovered this injunction. And I didn't come to history of medicine via Geoffrey Lloyd. I came to it in a very different way, by working on ancient inscriptions and working with archaeologists. But that marginal note is, which way? Yeah, is also misleading. Because although there are many classical texts which are published, there are many new texts, and there are many neglected texts. There are many new texts, not least because some literally have been turning up in original Greek very recently, but there are others in translation into Arabic, into medieval Latin, into medieval Hebrew, and there are rumors of a text on ophthalmology in Armenian, a language I confess I do not read. But, and this is the...
Here's something fun, is that Ammon is right, that there are untranslated Galen texts. Isn't that fun?
point I want to make to all of you. Much of what my work has consisted on over the last 50 years has been dealing with texts that have been in front of our eyes. They have been neglected. Why? They've been there. They've been there on the page. They've been cited 500 years ago. But they are totally unknown because they are written by my two most famous favorite authors after Galen, Anonymous and Pseudo-Galen. I love Pseudo-Galen. He really is a great chap. And it seems to be something that's typical of classicists and indeed of literary historians, begging your pardon, because as soon as we see that something is not by the famous author, we tend to put it on one side. We leave it. We think it's not important. Whereas my conviction is that by looking at these things without reference to their famous author, we may actually discover a good deal more about the past, about ancient literature, medieval Renaissance literature, than we.
And if you aren't familiar with why this is so important, so Ammon goes, like his whole shtick is like, hey, so we have these untranslated Galen texts, and that's why scholars aren't talking about this. And what we can do is we can just take these Galen texts and we can just compare them with the Bible, and that'll give us all the secrets about what we didn't know about the Bible, about Jesus and the rights and little kids and whatever else. Now, when you actually ask Ammon for the sources, because he doesn't even put them on the screen half the time. He doesn't tell you where he actually got it from. But when you actually look at the sources, they don't really say anything like it as far as what he wants you to think about the sources. But what makes it tough is that there actually is truth that some of these sources are not translated. But that doesn't mean that the ones he's talking about aren't translated. Another thing is that Neil, Gnostic Informant, and Stephen recently interviewed Dr. Vivian Nutton, and that's going to come out very soon. And yes, speak of the devil, Cross Bible Official, Stephen. Vivian Nutton, his book, Ancient Medicine, is a must-read. So yes, Nutton is one of the top scholars on this topic. Stephen actually sent me this video. But there's a new video coming out on Stephen's channel on this very topic. And basically what they're going to do is they ask Dr. Nutton, hey, what do you think about this claim? And the ones that Ammon's making. And Nutton basically is like, no, that's ridiculous. That doesn't say anything like that. So Ammon wants to say, hey, yeah, so the Galen texts tell you this and this and this about the ancient rites and medicine and whatever. And Dr. Vivian Nutton's like, yeah, so they barely even mention anything about cults or any of this. He's mostly just talking about medicine. And if they do, it's just like a vague reference like, hey, so this person came by who just happens to be in this ancient cult or whatever. And he's talking about this, and this is a situation. So yeah, there's Dr. Nutton is the expert, so much that he wrote a paper with Ammon's doctoral advisor, and Nutton, you will see, says that, hey, there's nothing here. Okay, but let's keep going.
Ever expected. And secondly, and this is again, I think, something that classicists have a good deal, shall we say, to explain. If something is in translation, we don't, or rather certainly when I was young, we didn't like to use it. Classicists have a reputation for studying languages. And so if we find something translated by somebody else, we tend not to bother with it. Or rather, we do so surreptitiously. It's a thing we read underneath the bedclothes. Galen survives in translation. Arabic, Latin, and even in modern German translation, there are 500 pages, of which the only printed texts available are in a modern German translation from the Arabic from the Syriac, from the Greek, 3 or 4 removes from the original. And so classicists have run away from pseudo, they've run away from translated. And what I'm going to tell you about today is why one should look at some of these things and what we can learn from them. Now, very briefly, for those of you who are not students of Susan and don't know who Galen was, then here is a very, very brief biography. He's born in the year 129 AD at Pergamum, modern Bergama in Western Turkey. He studied there. He went down the coast to Smyrna. He went to Alexandria in Egypt, which then was the greatest medical center. He comes back home in 162 to 166. He comes to Rome, and he says he made a great reputation for himself, such a reputation that his competitors hated him, and he was forced to leave Rome. Under parenthesis, I entirely agree with his competitors. He was a, well, 4-letter word. He was always right, and he told you so. And you can see why his competitors did not like him. In 166, he was forced to flee. He went back to Pergamum. 2 years later, he's recalled by the emperors, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, to come back with them on military campaign. He joins them in camp, and the emperor, before they go on campaign, have a great disaster. Lucius Verus, the emperor, dies. Marcus Aurelius takes the body back to Rome, and all the camp, or at least the officials there, return to Rome. He stays, Galen among them, probably in 169, and he stays there for probably the rest of his life with interruptions. Marcus Aurelius wants to take him back on campaign, but Galen says, oh, no, the god forbids me. I've got to stay in Rome. And he acts as an imperial physician, probably for the rest of his life. We don't know when he died. It could be as late as 216. We don't know where he died. I think he could very well have died in Pergamum, but that's almost a minor point. What did he do? He writes in Greek. He wrote over 300 books. Makes my 13 look trivial. He didn't write usually in the sense which we use the word. He had people taking down words that he was speaking. Oh. So you take down my words accurately, please, and I would then take them up and use them and publish them. And that was a book. He wrote on anything from grammar, lexicography, anatomy, pharmacology, anything on medicine, philosophy, ethics. And even though his personal library was destroyed in a fire in Rome in 192, much of his writings survive today. Probably around 150 books. Now, the standard edition in Greek, and that the easiest way of describing it to you is size. The standard edition today in Greek occupies 3 feet of space on my shelves. 3 feet. Okay, half of it's in Latin translation, but nevertheless, 1.5 feet is a substantial amount. There's another foot of material in Greek that has turned up since 1822.
Appreciate that, Stephen. Okay, so so this is very important here. So he's talking about the vast amount of works that Galen wrote or people wrote for him, whatever. So this is very important in a lot of conversations because Ammon will be talking to people and then someone will be honest and they'll say, hey, yeah, I haven't read all of Galen because guess what? There's a lot of Galen, 300 titles. Uh, I mean, has anybody read all of Galen? Has the greatest experts read all of Galen? I mean, maybe. But when that means how that communicates to a lot of people when you're watching is like, oh, well, you haven't even read Galen, so you don't even know anything enough to comment on this topic. Or so humility can be interpreted as, oh, this person doesn't know enough, and so I'm just going to trust Ammon because at least he knows enough to comment on this. And that's actually what happened with Luke in his conversation with Ammon, where he's like, yeah, I didn't read all of Galen, but Luke, like on several different topics in that conversation, showed why there are problems with what Ammon says. You don't need to read all of Galen to know that Ammon is making stuff up, and not to mention that Ammon doesn't even really share what his actual sources that he uses are, and then when you find the sources, they don't have any relation to what Ammon says they are. But that's a conversation for another day.
And there's another foot, at least, of books in translation. And there's more to come. I can say with certainty that within the next 15 years, we are likely to have published another 8 or 9 inches worth of text, including a commentary on the Hippocratic text, Airs, Waters, and Places, which is going to revolutionize our ideas on ancient seamanship, on the names for the
Not the seaman that you're thinking of.
winds. Because Galen gains his information from going down to the docks and talking with ship's captains and so on. So there's more to come, which is being worked on mainly by Arabic experts. So, as they say, watch this space. But Galen...
This is a 10-year-old video, so those works are probably published by now.
Presents as a problem. 3 feet of Greek, let's say. And all the surviving medicine in Greek is either by Galen, or it's by Hippocrates, his great hero, or it fills in gaps that Galen did not deal with. So Galen doesn't like women. So if you want to know about gynecology, you've got to read a book by a man called Serenus. Galen never wrote on botany or botanical plants. So that is why the Greek author Dioscorides survives. And the only works that, if you like, don't fall into those categories are works that survive under his name, my friend Pseudo Galen. And one of the great difficulties I've had, scholars have had, over the last 50 years, is to try and find a context for Galen. Because if all you know about what is going on is one person, it's very difficult to understand as historians what is happening. And so one has to use the evidence of other historians. One's got to use the evidence of epigraphy, Latin and Greek inscriptions. One's got to use the evidence of archaeology in order to provide a context. And one has got to find these other texts. And what I'm going to talk about today are some of these pseudo texts which are there, but which almost nobody has ever bothered to look at. Now, almost everybody here will have heard of the Hippocratic Oath. It is the most famous text surviving from antiquity.
Galen pretty much worshipped, he didn't actually worship, but he pretty much worshipped Hippocrates, which is very interesting. He called him the divine Hippocrates. Not that he literally said he was a god, but yeah, he thought very, very, very highly of him.
It's second only to the Bible in the number of times it's quoted. But did you know that there was actually an ancient commentary on the Hippocratic Oath surviving under the name of Galen? Not entirely, it's only in fragments. But I think we may have about a third to a half of the original commentary in Arabic. It's an amazing text. It's written by somebody who came from or worked in the same time, the town as Galen. He comes from Pergamum. It's a man who writes in Greek. It's a man who is living at the same time as Galen. It's a man who knows the streets of Pergamum, who has visited the great temple of Asclepius. And if you go to Pergamum today, and it is one of the most spectacular cities of the ancient world, you can go out to the Asclepieion and you will find it as this author describes it. Who is it? Do we know who it is? Well, at one point I thought it was Galen, but I'm now convinced it's not, but it's by one of his teachers. And the reason I don't think it's by Galen is that Galen never uses the Hippocratic Oath in any of his surviving texts, never mentions it. And secondly, in his catalogue of his writings, he never mentions a commentary on the Hippocratic Oath.
So that's interesting that there are some texts that's debated whether it's Galen or not. So you quote it and you're like, well, are we actually quoting Galen or is it somebody else?
So we have something written by a man living, working in the same city at the same time. And it's a man, I think, called Pelops, who taught Galen. Wow, it's his teacher. And what does it show us? One, this man is learned. Now, the fragments are not concerned with medical ethics. They don't talk about abortion. They don't talk about confidentiality. They don't talk about all those things which people cite the Hippocratic Oath for today. In part, because of the way these fragments have been transmitted, and the details are on the handout somewhere, they are dealing with three things: the origin of medicine, the life of Hippocrates, and the life of the god Asclepius. Who invented medicine? Well, says this author, that the gods invented medicine, possibly. And the gods sent it to mankind in a dream. And each part of the world may have its own origins of medicine. Some people say it's the Greeks. Some people say it's the Egyptians. Some people say it's the Syrians. Some people say it's the Indians or the Persians or the Slavs. Slavs, it may be a misprint, maybe a mistranslation for Scythians and North people in southern Russia, or even those mysterious inhabitants of Italy, the Etruscans. What's the origin of medicine? And this author quotes Greek geographers, he quotes Greek poetry, he quotes passages from Greek poetry that no longer exist. the life of Hippocrates, again, is fairly well known from surviving biographies of Hippocrates. So there's not much there. But with Asclepius, it's entirely different. We have new legends about Asclepius. And to my mind, the most fascinating topic comes right at the end, in which this man describes the statue of Asclepius at Pergamum, the great cult statue in the temple. And he uses the statue to explain how a doctor should behave. Why is there a snake on the staff of Hippocrates? Because a snake can get rid of its skin, and medicine is ever changing. A snake never sleeps. So the doctor must always be, I won't say awake, but alert. Why does the staff have leaves on it? Because medicine is ever growing, ever changing, and always bringing new life. And what is the cult symbol of Pergamum? What is the image on the statue that distinguishes Asclepius of Pergamum from the Asclepius of Rome, of Epidaurus, etc.? Any answers? It's an egg. And the god holds an egg in his hand. Why? Because the egg represents the world. And the doctor's job is to heal the world. And what's the worst thing you can do to an egg? Which is drop it. An egg is fragile. The egg symbolizes you. You are likely to fall ill. We are all fragile. And so this author, let's call him Pelops, describes how a doctor should behave in terms of what he sees on the great cult statue at Pergamum. And as far as I know, there is not a single historian of ancient religion of Asclepius cult who has ever referred to this text. And it's been in English for over 50 years. That's my first. My second is a book translated fairly recently, edited by Caroline Petit, which is called The Introduction to Medicine. It's quite long. It doesn't mention Galen, but we can tell it's contemporary because it's some connection with a philosopher who lived at the time. It's Hippocratic because he believes in the medicine of Hippocrates, like Galen, but it's different from anything else we have in Greek from that period, in that half of it is to do with surgery. We know little about surgery in antiquity. We've got hundreds of instruments, but suddenly we have a text here which tells you how to do surgery. And there's nothing like it between the Roman author Celsus 100 years previously and a Greek author writing 400 years later. This is a text on surgery, almost unknown, because it's pseudo, because it was only available until recently in Latin and Greek, and it's now available, I'm afraid, in French, but you can't have everything. And the rest of this talk...
That's another fun thing. So even if it's translated, it might not be translated in English, but might be translated into something like French.
I'm going to talk is about 3 texts to do with drugs. All of them are contemporary with Galen. All of them circulated in Greek under the name of Galen. One of them, which is on the virtues of the centaury plant, which is a famous herb, was translated in 1341 into Latin, but it was then lost in Greek. But it remained in Latin translation and used by pharmacologists. It's quoted in manuals of pharmacology right through into the 16th century. And the pharmacologists used it far more than scholars interested in what we call the complete works of Galen. Who are the authors? What can we say about the authors? Well, there were these three texts. There are two of them which are called on Theriac. One's for a man called Piso, so I call that the Ad Pisonem. One dedicated to a man called Pamphilianus. That's my name, Ad Pamphilianum. And
by the way, Theriac is the text that Ammon cites when he's trying to say that Paul in the book of Acts is using, the knowledge from Galen or Theriac, or maybe just calling it common knowledge. I don't know a specific view on where he thinks he specifically got it from, but he's saying that that's how Paul was able to survive the snake bite. And it wasn't a miracle like the text actually seems to describe. No, Ammon apparently thinks that Paul had secret snake knowledge on venom and cures. So he thinks that the actual cures worked. So that's interesting.
My text on Centauri. Who are the authors? Well, it's always good to live long enough to confess you made a mistake. And over 20 years ago, I concluded on the balance of probabilities that the Ad Pisonem was by Galen. Why? Because he's a Hippocratic author. He loves Plato, like Galen. He'd studied in Alexandria, where Galen studied. He came to Rome. He was associated with the imperial court from the 170s onwards for at least 35 years, like Galen. So and I said, we have we a choice? Was this man Galen? Or is it somebody who looks very much like Galen and has had his own career exactly like Galen? Now, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a PhD thesis, and there's been a group working in France on it. And it now seems to me quite clear that this cannot be by Galen. It's the wrong language and so on. I'll say a little bit more about it. But basically, all those ticks, all the things we use when we write, all the things I use when I speak, the ums and ers and the this and all the things which you find in Galen, genuine, are not there in this author. And whereas Galen writes in, at times, long sentences, this man can hardly finish a sentence. He goes on and on. And I said, we're either dealing with a Galen who's senile, or we've got a genuine, a new author, contemporary, who did the same thing. And I think now on the balance of probabilities, this author is not Galen. The second text on the Centauri is written by a Greek who had lived and studied in Rome. I'm coming back to this. And he's got a medical brother called Papias somewhere in the Greek world. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, he's a Methodist author, and I'll explain that in a moment. Methodist does not mean he's a follower of John Wesley or anything like that. It just means that he followed a particular method. And the final one is also a Greek. The author was a Greek who lived, studied in Rome about AD 200. We know that because there's a citation from this book about 25 years later, and he too was connected with the court administration. So we've got three authors all living in Rome at the same time as Galen.
Right. No, that's a great point. Yeah. So Ammon does not actually share his sources. He puts something on the screen that looks like Greek, and he never actually shows any kind of real English translation from any other scholar. He just says, "Hey, just trust me. I'm gonna just point to random references in the TLG, and boom, there it is. That's the way to just translate this, because this is what I said." But yeah, there's no link to Galen or the text that he claims is nonsense he spouts. Exactly.
And between them, they tell us about the city of Rome. Now, when you are brought up to listen to hear about Rome, we all think of Rome being inhabited by people who spoke Latin. Half the city of Rome spoke Greek. Rome by 150 AD was a Greek city. People spoke Greek. The emperor wrote in Greek. And Rome is now a center of education for Greeks. The author of the Ad Pamphilianum says he had a teacher called Maicius Aelianus. You can't get a more Roman sounding name than that. Who taught him about plague and who taught him about theriac. I'll explain about theriac in a moment. The author of the text on the Centauri says he had Roman teachers. One of them was a man called Apollonius, a man, he says, a witty man, prone to making jokes, clearly a good professor. He was highly approved. And this man also, I think, was a Methodist author. Now, Methodism, following the method, was something that grew up in Rome. People began to study it, invent it in Rome. It was brought by Greeks, made by Greeks who lived in Rome, and it became the most popular type of medicine. Galen complains at one point that nobody believes in his Hippocratic medicine anymore. Instead, it's Methodist medicine. And this man begins his treatise rather like communists in the 1960s with references to Marx and Engels. The very first sentence refers to Themison, the great teacher. And Themison is the founder of Methodism. So we have a sort of 2nd century AD equivalent of Marx and Engels. These people studied in Rome. Now, you can't imagine a 4th century BC Athenian coming to Rome to study anything. Here we have Rome developing as an educational center for Greeks. But let's have a look at the authors a little while. The author of the Ad Pamphilianum lives and studies in Rome. He's actually moved away. His description uses the past tense. I saw this, not I see this. And he dedicates his book to a Cretan, a Greek, who must be living back in Rome, I think, who has served in Egypt and who served in Crete. And these three texts also tell us about culture. They tell us about who they knew, who they worked with. The author of the text for Piso mentions a female philosopher, Arria, a Platonist philosopher most dear to me. If some people who thought this text was genuine Galen believe this was Galen's girlfriend, but she happened to be married. He's a friend of a man called Aelius Antipater, whom we know from other sources. We have a biography of him. And he was the equivalent today of a chat show host. He was a man people flocked to hear speak. He was a man with great charisma. And he became the Greek secretary to the Roman emperors. So clearly this author is very much associated with the highest circles. And what about the author, this text for Pamphilianus? Well, we haven't really got much beyond that Cretan as an example. But what you can see is that this man has had a good education. He writes the most incredibly flowery Greek. He writes, it's as if he was almost writing poetry at times. He uses language that we find in honorary inscriptions. And the author of De Virtute, which is a much shorter text, although it's small, and although it doesn't survive in Greek, you can see it is extraordinarily well organized, well put together. I want to say a little bit more about Piso, the author of the text from Piso, because this is a good example of how Greeks are being incorporated into the Roman Empire, and how, if you like, you can't draw a distinction between Latin and Greek. He's learned. He is a Greek. He quotes Homer, he quotes Plato, he quotes Euripides, Hecuba, I think. So he's had the good Greek education. Interestingly, the three medical examples that he gives are all taken from famous incidents in Roman history. He talks about Hannibal, and you've probably heard of Hannibal, the Carthaginian who almost captured Rome and who at the end of his life was in service with a Greek monarch out in the Greek East. There's a story of King Mithridates, Mithridates the poisoner. And the story that is told, and it takes 2 pages, is the story of how Mithridates, to protect himself, took theriac, this antidote, this anti-poison drug. And he took it daily. And by the time he wanted to commit suicide, when the Romans had defeated him, he couldn't. No poison worked. So he had to bring in a slave to kill him. And this author actually gives you the name of the slave. And finally, Cleopatra. And incidentally, did you know that Cleopatra taught Galen? No. Did you know that Cleopatra's beauty book survives? And if any young ladies would like to know Cleopatra's beauty book, come and see me afterwards and I will tell you for a fee how to use cosmetics. Cleopatra was famous as a writer of pharmacology. And this text is the longest account of her death. It names the slaves who attended her. It talks about how she used the asp to commit suicide. And it's one of the sources for Shakespeare. These are Roman stories. They're also known in Greek, but these are primarily Roman stories. And they're written by a cultured Greek who ends with, I hope you will find it, a witty ending. And I shall just quote, because he says, the last page, you've got to amend the text a little bit. And he says he was the judge. And it's not clear whether he's judge at a trial or judge at an academic debate. And he says, he comes to the end of the last paragraphs. He said, and Paizo, you know how things can come to an end, should come to an end. He said, because when you were this judge, you had these speakers in front of you who were going on. They continue to find many, many occasions to continue the argument long after it might have been regarded as settled. And so you remarked, even the gods are silent between prophecies. Oracles can fall silent. Winter storms make the sea unsailable. Rivers dry up and flow again, while even the earth does not produce her fruits continuously.
Yeah, Felix, you got to get your glam on.
Hence the necessity and the propriety of knowing when to stop and of coming to a swift conclusion, as I shall do. Now, this is a wonderful ending to the book. It's literary, it's rhetorical, it appeals to Paizo, and so on. Culture, cultivated prose. And finally, these texts on drugs are also interesting because they're texts of a sort that we have lost. They're texts about a single drug, on the Centauri or Theriac. They're texts about a panacea. Centauri cures everything. Cures internal diseases, cures external diseases, wounds, bites, gladiators, sword cuts, women's diseases, and in particular, snake bites. And if you want to understand ancient snake law, this is the text for you. Lots and lots and lots of snakes are mentioned. It's something that you can use. The author tells you how to make Centauri, how to take it, how to cut it, how to use it, how to make it into a drink, a poultice, etc. It's a universal cure. And the other two texts are on Theriac. Theriac is an ancient word which means animal drug. It's a drug that can be used against animal and snake bites. But, says both authors, it's a universal cure. It's not just a tonic. It's not just an antidote. It's a tonic. You can use it all the time. Marcus Aurelius took a daily dose. Septimius Severus, we know from Galen, liked to take it as that sort of thing, a tonic you take in the morning.
Yeah, so this is the Theriac. This is what Ammon talks about a lot, but he thinks that Jesus actually took this as well. And really interesting stuff, actually, from a historical perspective.
But, say both authors, you can use it for everything. And they give you a long list, including mental diseases. And they say just keep using it, because once it gets old, it loses its power. I've taken it. It was a horrible, dark, brown, sticky substance that came from the souk in Damascus. It worked. I'm still alive 50 years later. But say these authors, you can use it for everything. But there's a problem. Who are the people who go around?
Okay, so there were different texts that talk about the theriac. So some will have like a certain list of ingredients in it, others with other things. So some had like over 60 ingredients in their version of it. Later medieval versions had even more than that. So this could contain opium, synonym, I can't talk, cinnamon, myrrh, ginger, frankincense, viper flesh, herbs and resins. That's so fascinating. That, I mean, if you take an opium, like, yeah, you're probably gonna feel better. That's probably true. That's awesome.
Offering drugs and saying this will cure you of everything. Now, in America, you have television. You have people offering you cures on the television. You have snake oil salesmen. And as soon as you go around saying you've got a wonderful, remarkable drug that can cure everything.
That's funny though, because there's the term snake oil salesman, but this theriac is supposedly a supposed to cure snake venom. So that's a funny little connection there.
You run into the accusation that you're a snake oil salesman, that you're a charlatan. And the Greek word is crowd puller. You bring them in, you stand in the marketplace and you say, look, this is how you get this wonderful cure. And as soon as you go around saying, I've got this wonder cure, well, people are going to disbelieve you. Do you believe everything you see on television? Of course not. Do you believe Mr. Trump? No.
I do think people back then were not as skeptical as the average person today, but I do think that is because of just all the different revolutions that we've had in science and in thought and education, where there was a lot less education back then. So, for example, not everybody is big into questions and skepticism, stuff like that. But for example, if you compare the typical person like going to a Christian church, oftentimes they'll just soak up whatever and just accept whatever their pastor tells them, right? Compared to someone who might be just a little bit more skeptical of religious topics. So there might be more of an idea of rejection or skepticism, more questioning. Like it's interesting that like I naturally, if someone tells me something, I'm going to ask certain questions. I'm going to be skeptical, but oftentimes I'm just trying to figure out more information about it. But I'll talk to people that I know personally, and they're just like not skeptical at all, and kind of just like, okay, yeah, sounds good, sounds interesting. But I'm not saying that people in the ancient world were dumb necessarily. There were certainly dumb people, just like there are today. But it does seem like we live in a modern age of skepticism.
This is the same for antiquity. And so these authors have got to distinguish themselves from the snake oil salesman. Galen says, my cures are not miraculous, they're Hippocratic. These people say, my cures are effective, but that's not good enough. So what they do is they appeal to the status of the person. These people who are vouching for my treatise are the highest members of...
Yeah, exactly. Oh my goodness. That is an interesting coincidence there. Like the snake oil salesman of the Old West, cures everything.
Society. Or they're well known. Brother Papias, this Greek, the brother of the author of De Virtutibus, is a Greek physician somewhere. And it's very curious that we know of a Greek physician living at the same time as Galen, called Papias, whose brother, or certainly relative, close relative, happens to be a colleague of Galen in the imperial court at the same time, and happens to be a Methodist author. Is this royal doctor the author? I don't know. But they all claim to expertise. I have learned this. Look what I have learnt. Look at my teachers. Look, I'm not a snake oil salesman. The author of De Virtutibus says, when I heard about all this, I just refused to believe it. And my teacher, Apollonius, once used the drug. And he sent a slave. He said, bring me some centaury. And I thought he was joking. He said, because he was well known for practical jokes. Homo erit valde simplex. He was a very witty man. And I couldn't believe him. But of course, I've seen it work. I've done all these cures. I've seen this. And the people who support me are very distinguished indeed. Valde approbati. And besides, if you look at what I write, I'm learned. I can quote Homer. I can quote earlier pharmacologists. I can quote you a long list of authorities. I know the name of the slave who killed Mithridates. I'm a learned man. Believe me. Now, if all professors went out like that, I'm not quite sure what we would do with medicine today, but I'm learned, believe me. And similarly, how you write Greek tells you something about the person you are. I can speak in long sentences, and I can speak without hesitation, repetition, or whatever, which shows I am a learned man. Believe me, I'm a good preacher. All these are there to show that the author of this book on a miraculous drug is not a snake oil salesman. He's not somebody who's going around to sell you a drug, as one of these crowd pullers did, to murder your grandmother. So what have we got? These are texts. They're there. 4 of them have been accessible in print since at least 1490. The Arabic commentary is more recent. Nobody has really bothered with them since about the year 1550. But what they do is they provide us with different perspectives. They provide us with an antidote, if you like, to Galen. They show Greeks like Galen coming to Rome even via Alexandria. They remind us of Greek culture in the Roman world, how important Greek was even in the capital of Rome. They remind us of a medical world that we wouldn't otherwise know about. These texts on single drugs are almost unique. There's one called On the Vulture, which is clearly a sort of magical text. And there's another one written about 500 AD. But we wouldn't otherwise know about these little texts because over the centuries, why bother spending time and money and parchment copying out a single text when you could copy out at the same time a very large book of drugs? We're lucky to have these. They're an example of something which we know from papyri, there are a couple of examples there, must have existed, but have long since disappeared. And finally, Galen, to my mind, and I've spent 50 years or more reading Galen. Galen is one of the most brilliant authors. He's one of the most fascinating authors, and Susan's books will tell you how fascinating he is from the point of view of the social climate in which he works. But these books do something that nobody else can do. They help us fill in that context. They help us see that Galen is not perhaps quite as unique as he wants us to believe. His opponents are not quite as stupid, as idiotic. And they also show us that he's not the only Greek who went to Alexandria and then came back to Rome and became an imperial physician. So thank you.
All right. So that was a really interesting video by the scholar, Dr. Vivian Nutton. People should check out his interview on Gnostic Informant. That'll be a really interesting video. He's going to very clearly debunk what Ammon has said. But I did want to comment just one thing before we get going here. So on that Theriac, in the, say, about 1st century, that's kind of when you start seeing the Theriac come about. But it's 1st century BCE and then onward. But in the 2nd century, it kind of becomes formalized as a ritual. So Galen describes that the Theriac is publicly supervised, performed before crowds, regulated by imperial authority, executed with extreme precision, aged for months or years. So that's like a public ritual to give out cures, or basically just maybe drugs, like actual drugs. And he says that the Theriac was expensive, adulteration was common, imperial endorsement increased the trust. So in other words, if you have actual leaders in the government promoting it, then there's going to be people more trustworthy of it. They're going to see it as more like a legit thing that we should do. And yeah, it's interesting that Galen wanted pharmacological standardization. So he wanted to make it so that there's, essentially one combination of substances you put together rather than everybody just coming on themselves to do that. And then, yep. So, yeah. Anyways, we'll that's about all I had to say there. So, anyways, thank you guys for watching on. Thank you, Cyril or Cyril, Lux, for Lex being in the channel, or sorry, Felix, and all the other ones that have joined. Fun conversations, and just a tease for what we have going on next. So I found this like really dumb Ammon Hillman AI that somebody made. So I'm going to talk to this Ammon Hillman person in AI, almost like I'm talking to Ammon Hillman. So that'd be fun. And apparently some people uploaded his history of stuff, so you can like quote unquote talk to him. Another thing is that somebody made a video, and this is just nonsensical, but I think it's hilarious. Somebody made a video saying that Ammon Hillman actually died. That this is the real Ammon Hillman, Jacob Michael Hillman, and I mean he does look somewhat like Ammon Hillman, and the Ammon Hillman real person. Who is he? Did he use magic to come back to life? Who knows? We'll find out in the next episode. But all right, I'll see you guys.